The summer of 1994, three young brothers vanished without a sound after attending a local fair in the small town of Elmridge. No signs, no goodbye, just an eerie silence and a mother's aching heart. For nearly 30 years, the case remained unsolved, but one forgotten photograph, rediscovered in a dusty attic, would ignite a chain of revelations too devastating to ignore. The morning of May 3, 1994, began like any other spring day in Elmridge, Oregon. The scent of blooming rhododendrons lingered in the air, mixing with the earthy aroma of damp soil from last night's drizzle. Marla Brandt stood barefoot in the kitchen, humming to the gentle rhythm of the radio as she stirred scrambled eggs. Her boys, Caleb, Micah, and Noah, had already burst out the back door, chasing each other in a blur of laughter and matching red windbreaker. They were 7, identical in face, but each a distinct universe of thoughts and moods. Caleb was the thinker, Micah the talker, and Noah the one who watched quietly, soaking in everything. Marla, 36, had raised them mostly on her own. Her husband had died of a stroke just a year after their birth, and her father, Walter, had moved in shortly after to help. Walter, once a strong-willed man of principle, had suffered a debilitating stroke 2 years ago that left him confined to a wheelchair, robbed of his speech, but not his awareness. That morning, as the boys ran past the porch, Walter had simply lifted his eyes from his crossword puzzle, nodding ever so slightly. Breakfast was ready, but the boys had yet to come back. It wasn't unusual. They often stretched their playtime into the far corners of the yard. But after 10 minutes, Marla stepped onto the porch. The air was still, too still. She called their names. No answer. A gust of wind pushed open the side gate, creaking on rusted hinges. It should have been locked. Her stomach tightened. She stepped down the stairs and followed the worn path through the backyard, past the tool shed and under the apple tree in bloom. No boys, no giggles, no sign of them playing hide-and-seek. That was when she noticed the tire tracks, fresh, narrow, not from her father's wheelchair. They led from the gate to the far side of the yard, disappearing into the woods behind the property. Her breath caught. She ran. A frantic hour later, the police were at her door. Officers combed through the yard while a deputy took her statement. She couldn't remember locking the gate. Maybe one of the boys had undone it? No, she was always so careful. The tracks behind the house were photographed. A K9 unit was called in. Walter sat in his usual spot on the porch, blanket over his knees, eyes tracking every motion. When an officer approached him gently, trying to ask if he'd seen anything, he blinked slowly. Tried to move his hand. His finger twitched slightly toward the woods, but nothing more. The day dragged into night. Search teams brought in lights. Natures joined the search. Helicopters hovered low over the trees. Marla couldn't stop shaking. In one of the search party's hands was a red windbreaker, Caleb's, found snagged on a thorn bush. But no blood. No other trace. Inside the house, Marla stood by her father. She held his hand and asked again, "Did you see them go? Did someone take them?" His eyes watered. He tried to speak, his lips trembling but useless. He patted the armrest in frustration. Then, with slow determination, he pushed a small notepad toward her. She handed him a pen. After several strained minutes, he scratched something faintly. Black truck. Man. Red hat. The handwriting was shaky, almost illegible, but it was something. The police took the note. They asked around, checked traffic cams in the area. Elmridge was a small town, not many ways in or out. No black trucks matching the description had been seen. No strangers reported. No red hats noted. The boys had seemingly vanished into thin air. Reporters arrived by the next morning. Satellite fans parked outside. Triplets vanished from their own backyard, the headlines read. Marla's face, pale and frozen in grief, made the evening news. She hated every second of it. Her boys were not a story. They were her sons. 3 days passed. The search extended into nearby creek. All in vain. The boys had vanished, and with each passing day, the hope they would return in one piece began to erode like the banks of the stream. Still, Marla refused to give up. She slept little, kept their room untouched, toys lined neatly on the shelves. She set a place for them at breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Walter's health declined that month. He grew more agitated, often pointing toward the woods and mumbling incoherently. The doctors said it was psychological regression from stress. Marla wasn't so sure. She began documenting everything he tried to communicate, convinced he knew more than he could express. But it was a locked vault she had no key for. By the end of May, the official search ended. The sheriff's department issued a statement. No evidence of abduction or foul play has been confirmed. The investigation will remain open, but all active search efforts are concluded. The town moved on. Marla did not. She stayed in Elmridge, took a part-time job at the library, kept her house exactly as it was. Every year on May 3rd, she sat under the apple tree and read aloud from the boys' favorite books. It was the only way she could still hear their laughter. The morning sun filtered through clouds like gauze as Deputy Carla Minot zipped up her rain jacket and crouched by the shoreline of Lake Annerly. It was the 4th day since the Brant triplets had vanished, and the area 2 kilometers west of the family home had just become the newest focus point after a volunteer stumbled on something wedged under a flat rock. It was a child's sneaker, red with faded blue laces and a warm sole. Carol turned it in her gloved hands, studying every surface. Oddly, it was pristine. The surrounding mud was thick and damp from the past 2 days of rain, but the shoe? Not even a smudge, not a water stain, no imprint in the mud where it lay. The volunteers swore it hadn't been there the day before. That raised a flag. This wasn't dropped, Carolyn muttered to her partner. It was placed. She bagged the shoe and called it in. Forensics would run it through their system, but deep down she doubted they'd find anything new. Her instincts screamed manipulation. Someone wanted them looking here, now, and not somewhere else. Meanwhile, back in Elmridge, Marla stood in her living room, watching through a lace curtain as 2 officers spoke quietly by their patrol car. Her house had turned into the center of a silent storm. Questions, visits, reporters at the edge of her driveway, but no answers. Her father slept fitfully in the next room, and she hadn't touched her coffee in hours. The phone rang often, but none of the calls brought good news. Just neighbors offering condolences or strangers claiming psychic visions. Detective Saul Kinnard stepped into the room holding a clipboard. He was a tall, soft-spoken man with a calm demeanor that unnerved her more than comforted. "Mrs. Brant, we found a shoe by Lake Annerly," he said gently. "Do you recognize this?" He showed her a photo on his phone. She recognized it instantly. Caleb's. She had tied those laces herself the week before. "But it looks clean," she whispered, staring at the image. "It should be filthy if it was out there for days." Kinnard nodded. "That's what we're thinking, too. It may have been placed there recently. Someone may want us misdirected." Her hands clenched. "Why would someone do that?" He didn't answer. Later that afternoon, as officers canvassed the neighborhood again, they knocked on the door of Dale Hemsworth, Marla's next-door neighbor for the past 6 years. Dale was 42, always wore denim shirts, and had a gruff friendliness that bordered on suspicious charm. He'd brought over spare eggs once when Marla was short, and just a week ago he'd mentioned casually that he and his fiancée were finally setting a date. September, maybe October. "Going to be a fall wedding," he'd said, eyes twinkling. But today Dale wasn't home. The blinds were down, the porch light was off, and his truck, the old navy blue Ford F-150, was gone. One of the officers, who'd grown up 2 streets over, remarked, "Funny, thought he was planning to stay a while." His name was flagged. The next day, investigators confirmed Dale had quit his job at the lumberyard 2 days after the boys disappeared. Claimed he had family business in New Mexico, no forwarding address. No engagement anymore either. When police called his supposed fiancée, she claimed they'd broken up months ago. "We haven't spoken in weeks," she said. "He was weird about kids, always too interested in other people's families." The officers exchanged glances. Red flags were multiplying. Marla was brought in again to answer more questions. She felt numb as the officers laid out the findings. The shoe. Dale's sudden disappearance. Her memory of Dale was vague in some parts. He was always just there, helpful, quiet. But now she remembered a day, maybe 3 months prior, when Noah had come home crying, saying Dale had yelled at him for running too close to his fence. At the time, she'd thought nothing of it. Boys were loud. Dale probably had a headache, but now it churned her stomach. Carolyn Minot dug further. She requested Dale's employment history, tracked his truck's registration, and reached out to state troopers along I-84. A camera near Pendleton, Oregon, caught a blurry photo of a truck matching his description 2 nights after the boys vanished. It wasn't enough for a warrant, but it was something. She pressed harder. Meanwhile, the town began to buzz with theories. Whispers filled grocery store aisles. Was Dale a child trafficker? Had the boys wandered too close to his property? Why was that shoe so clean? And what if Dale wasn't acting alone? Marla avoided the market. She stopped going to church. She turned down the radio when it played anything upbeat. Her world had shrunk to the silence of her empty home. Every time a car slowed outside, her heart jumped. That week, forensics confirmed the shoe did belong to Caleb. Trace analysis found no organic debris, no grass, no insect eggs, no moisture damage. It had been preserved, they said. But no fingerprints, no DNA not already in the family, a dead end. Walter had a bad episode that Friday. He thrashed in his sleep, knocking over a photo of the boys. When Marla tried to soothe him, he pointed again, this time not to the woods, but toward Dale's old house. His eyes locked with hers. That night she dreamt of Dale's truck parked behind her fence, headlights off, engine idling in the dark. When she woke, she wasn't sure if it was memory or imagination. Carla returned 2 days later, this time without her usual calm. "We tracked Dale's truck to a storage unit rental in Yakimeg," she said. The manager remembered a man matching his description dropping off a padlocked crate. The warrant came through late. Inside the unit were old tools, some crates of canned food, a stained mattress, and a single photograph of 3 boys standing by a swing set. It was the one they'd had in the yard before she replaced it last fall. The boys were facing away, but their stance, the identical way they tilted their heads, was unmistakable. Her throat tightened. "Do you think he took them?" she asked. Carla's face was unreadable. "We don't know, but he definitely watched them, maybe longer than we thought." The photograph found in Dale's storage unit had rekindled interest in the Brandt case, and within a week, the local news stations reignited coverage that had lain dormant for years. Footage from 1994 was pulled from dusty archives, showing a younger Marla standing beside her porch, voice trembling as she begged the public for help. Now, those same clips aired between segments about rising gas prices and town council debates. But they were back. Her boys' faces were back, frozen in time on every screen in Elmridge. Marla hated the attention. She'd never liked reporters, and she liked them even less now that they framed every update with a suspenseful soundtrack and phrases like chilling twist and rural mystery. It felt like entertainment to them, but the resurgence did bring one unexpected result: a phone call. It was the receptionist at Channel 4 News who first took the message, a man's voice, low and urgent, refusing to identify himself. "You're looking in the wrong place," he said. "Those boys weren't taken. They were moved, for protection. Someone knew what was happening in that house. They're in another state now. They were saved. The call lasted less than a minute. They station recorded it, handed it to the police, and aired a censored version on the 6 p.m. broadcast." Marla watched in silence, the words crawling under her skin like thorns. "Protection," she whispered. "From what?" The implication was clear. The man wasn't just suggesting the boys had survived. He was suggesting someone took them to get them away from her. The next day brought reporters to her front steps again, their questions sharper now. "Mrs. Brandt, do you know why someone would say your home wasn't safe? Have there been any prior complaints to child services? Is it true your father had sole care duties for extended periods?" Marla closed the door in their faces. Inside, her father stared blankly at the TV, unaware, or perhaps too aware, of the storm unfolding. That night, as rain tapped at the windows like cold fingers, Marla poured herself a drink she hadn't touched in years and stared at the fireplace, her thoughts drifting into past arguments, long-forgotten whispers between teachers at school pickups, awkward pauses from neighbors when they asked about her boy's behavior. She remembered a moment, Noah screaming during a thunderstorm, Walter grabbing his wrist too tightly, yelling louder than the thunder itself. She'd intervened, of course. She'd apologized. She'd thought it was over. But had it been? 3 days later, a woman called her from Portland. Her name was Renee Clifton, and they'd been close once, back in the late 80s, working together at a small church group that handled local outreach. Renee now worked for Oregon's Department of Human Services. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "I probably shouldn't be doing this, she said, "but after I saw the broadcast, I remembered something. In 1989, we received an anonymous report about your home. It mentioned possible emotional abuse. Nothing physical, no bruises. But the caller said the children, then still toddlers, seemed scared of your father." Sadie shouted, "Isolated them, kept them away from other adults." Marla froze. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" Renee hesitated. "The case was closed. No follow-up was done. The file was flagged as unsubstantiated. I didn't even work that region at the time. But I checked after that broadcast. It's still there, archived." Marla thanked her, numbness crawling through her body like cold water seeping into bone. That night she pulled out the old storage box of the boys' artwork, tiny scribbles with crayon suns and stick figures. In one, 3 figures stood inside a square house, while a large red-faced figure hovered above them outside the window. Caleb's name was scrawled in the corner. She hadn't looked at that drawing in years. Maybe never truly looked. She didn't sleep. Detective Kinnard returned 2 days later with a transcript of the anonymous caller's message. Ran voice analysis, he said. "The quality's bad. No match in our systems. But what's more important is the wording. This wasn't a hoaxer." He referenced internal details, dates, the boys' names, things not published anywhere. Whoever he is, he knows something. Marla didn't know what to feel. Her grief, already complicated by time and silence, now thickened with suspicion. Had she missed something? Or was this a calculated attempt to confuse and smear? She didn't know. But something else returned to her then, just a flicker of memory. The day after the boys vanished, a woman in a green coat had been standing on the sidewalk across the street. Not a reporter, not a neighbor. She'd been holding a clipboard. Marla remembered the coat, the way the woman kept glancing at the house. She'd assumed it was nothing, but what if it wasn't? She told Kinnard. He nodded, made a note. Every detail mattered now. Meanwhile, the press continued to spin. One headline read, "Triplets taken for their own safety." Another opined, "Secrets in the Brants' home." People she'd known for decades began avoiding eye contact. Her mail came with no return addresses. The town had turned. Walter grew worse. He spoke even less, if that was possible. His hands trembled when he saw the news, and once, just once, he pulled Marla's sleeve and pointed at himself, then drew 3 circles with his finger on the armrest. She didn't know if it meant guilt or memory or something else entirely. That weekend, someone spray-painted "Kids Deserved Better" on her garage door. She scrubbed it in silence, no tears, no outbursts, just the quiet resolve of someone too tired to protest. Renee called again. "I pulled more from the 1989 file. There was a note. Someone tried to follow up 6 months later, but the address listed was incorrect. It never reached the house." Marla closed her eyes. How many chances had slipped through her fingers, not through malice, but through misdirection and silence? And then another call. A woman this time, voice calm, deliberate. "They're not gone," she said. "They were never taken. They were hidden, protected. You don't understand yet, but you will." The line went dead. This message wasn't shared with the police. Not yet. By 1999, 5 years had passed since the boys vanished, and the energy around the case had withered like autumn leaves left too long in the gutter. The reporters had stopped calling. The investigators had moved on to newer crises. Detectives who once promised Marla they'd never stop searching now avoided eye contact when they passed her in the grocery store. The community that once rallied behind her had grown quiet, the way people do when tragedy becomes too inconvenient to remember. In January of that year, she received a thin envelope from the county sheriff's office. Inside was a formal notice, an official declaration that the investigation into the disappearance of Classic, Micah, and Noah Brant was being classified as inactive, pending any new evidence. The accompanying summary listed accidental drowning as the most plausible theory, citing the proximity of Lake Annerly and the absence of physical remains as supporting factors. Marla stared at the line, presumed deceased. Her hands shook. She hadn't been notified in person. No meeting, no phone call, just a document reducing her children to a statistic. She didn't scream or cry. She folded the letter, placed it in a drawer beneath her wedding photo, and turned off every light in the house. But even as the world moved on, something persisted, something private, deliberate, and deeply unsettling. Every year, on July 14th, the boy's birthday, no return address, no message, just a photograph. The first came in 1995, a shot of a foggy shoreline with 3 identical rowboats pulled onto the sand. The second, 1998, showed a wide field with 3 lone oak trees in the distance, perfectly spaced. In 1997, it was 3 red balloons rising into a pale sky. Always 3, always unmistakably intentional. At first, she brought them to the police. They logged the images, dusted for prints, found nothing. Eventually, they stopped caring. People do sick things, but Marla never believed it was random. The cards were too specific, too consistent. It wasn't mockery, it was a message. Or a memory, or maybe both. She kept them all in a small wooden box tucked in the back of her bedroom closet. Some nights she would take them out, one by one, lining them across the bed like evidence. She studied the light, the angle, the shadows, as if she could decode something no one else could see. One year the card featured a lake view with 3 telephone poles emerging from the mist. Every image whispered, "They're still here," or maybe, "We haven't forgotten." The uncertainty hollowed her out. She no longer knew if the cards were a lifeline or a punishment. By that point, Walter had passed. He died in the spring of 1998, just after the daffodils bloomed. His final weeks were spent in a quiet hospice center outside Portland, eyes rarely opened, voice long gone. Marla visited every day. On the last night, as she sat beside him, he opened his eyes, looked straight ahead, and mumbled a word she hadn't heard clearly, something like mirror or Miller, before exhaling one last time. She never found out what he meant. She told herself it didn't matter, but the weight of unspoken truths clung to her, heavy and wet like river stones. After the official case closure, she fell into routine. She kept the house. She took up painting, mostly landscapes, mimicking the tones and moods of the postcards. She spoke to few people, answered few people. Her hair turned silver at the temples. She no longer looked like the mother in those old TV interviews. But inside, the waiting never dulled. Her calendar marked only one date, July 14th, and she lived each year for its arrival. That day, she would walk to the mailbox before sunrise, as if the card might arrive early just for her. In 1999, the card showed 3 seagulls in flight above a rocky cliff. No message, no hint of location, but the back of the photo bore a tiny scratch, barely visible, a faint line under the postage stamp. Marla held it under a lamp. It looked like someone had etched it on purpose. A symbol, a letter, an initial. It looked like an S or perhaps a serpent twisting. She mailed it to Kinnard, who still worked cold cases. He called her back a week later. "We tried enlarging it. Could be a manufacturing defect, or maybe someone trying to get your attention, but unless there's more context..." He trailed off. She didn't push. She had learned not to expect anything. Some years the cards arrived with postmarks smudged, as if someone had intentionally wiped them. Once, it was from Nevada. Another year, it read Wyoming. One came from Montana, though the image, a stormy beach with 3 lighthouses, clearly wasn't taken anywhere near that landlocked state. Whoever was sending them either wanted to mislead or simply didn't care if she found them. Or maybe the real clue wasn't in the geography at all. Occasionally, she wondered if the cards were from one of the boys. Maybe Caleb had found a way. Maybe he remembered their birthdays, remembered her. Maybe he couldn't speak freely. Maybe someone else was helping him. She wrote replies sometimes, even though she had no address. She'd burn the letters in her fireplace, like smoke signals. "I'm still here," she'd whisper. "I still believe." That winter, she was at the grocery store when a man bumped into her near the soup aisle. He apologized quickly, too quickly, and walked away. Something about his voice stuck in her mind. She watched him walk out the exit, a little too fast, his shoulders hunched. The next day, she checked her mailbox early. No postcard, it was only February, but something had shifted. She could feel it, a restlessness in the air. She began collecting news clippings again, combing archives at the library for anything about missing children, mysterious sightings, people with fake identities. Most of it led nowhere, but one article caught her attention. It was buried in the back pages of a California weekly, reporting a small fire in a trailer outside Fresno. A neighbor claimed to have seen 3 young men leaving the scene in a rush, none of them speaking, one of them with a limp. The details were sparse, but a blurry image showed a wall behind the burned trailer with what looked like 3 handprints smudged in soot. It could mean nothing. Or everything. She clipped the article, folded it into her postcard box, and waited for July. In the spring of 2022, the dust in Marla's attic was thicker than memory itself, curling in rays of sunlight that cut through the small window like hesitant ghosts. Her niece, Grace, had offered to help her clear it out after a late snowfall collapsed a portion of the roof above the storage space. Grace, 24 and recently home from college, was the kind of curious soul who saw potential in the forgotten. While Marla sifted through boxes of old curtains and winter coats, Grace opened a plastic container filled with yellowing newspapers, all folded and brittle from years of disuse. "Aunt Marla, did you save all of these?" she asked, amused. Marla shrugged, wiping her hands on a drag indigestion. "Wait," she said, holding up a faded clipping. "Is this you?" Marla took the newspaper, her eyes narrowing to focus. It was an article from June 1994 covering the Elmridge Summer Jubilee, the town fair that had taken place just weeks before her sons disappeared. The photo beneath the headline showed a candid moment near a cotton candy stand. 3 boys with matching shirts and bowl cuts standing beside a tall man wearing dark sunglasses and a volunteer badge. The man's hand rested lightly on Micah's shoulder. Marla's heart caught in her throat. She had never seen this photo before. Her hands trembled as she traced the edges of the image. The boys' posture, their identical grins, unmistakably hers. And the man, his face mostly hidden by glasses and the downward tilt of his head, was unfamiliar. "This isn't right," she whispered. Grace took a photo of the clipping on her phone and enhanced it with a filter. The image sharpened just enough for the volunteer badge to show faint lettering, Child Hope, Oregon Chapter. That name itched at Marla's memory like a splinter. She asked Grace to scan the image and run it through a facial recognition app. Grace hesitated. That stuff isn't always reliable, but Marla was insistent. The results returned in less than 2 minutes. The software highlighted the man's face and generated a potential match, Stephen Cartwright. A public database listed him as a former volunteer coordinator for Child Hope, an organization that had dissolved in 1997 under financial and legal scrutiny. Marla immediately wrote down the name, the birth date, the last known address in Eugene. A quick search revealed scattered news from the late 90s, allegations, complaints, whispers. Nothing had stuck. No convictions. One article quoted a parent who accused him of excessive boundary violations during a summer camp. Another spoke of unusual relationships with children in foster programs. Each time, Cartwright had denied the claims, and each time the investigations ended without action. Still, his name surfaced often enough to stain. Marla printed the photo and brought it to Detective Kinnard, who now worked out of Salem and managed a portfolio of inactive cases. He remembered her immediately. When she slid the article across his desk, his jaw tensed. "That's definitely them," he said, tapping image and the general state of lead. They sent the image to a lab affiliated with the state's Department of Justice. Within 48 hours, the analysis came back with a 94% facial match to Stephen Cartwright. The case file reopened, quietly, without fanfare. Kinnard contacted the last known employer listed on Cartwright's file, a rural hardware supplier in Spokane. The company confirmed he'd left over a decade ago. They provided a post office box used for forwarding mail. It was registered to a new name, Simon Carlton. The address was tied to a remote cabin property in central Idaho. As the investigation deepened, Kinnard uncovered records showing Cartwright had attended multiple county fairs in 1994 as part of his outreach initiative, including the Elmridge Jubilee. His logs noted volunteering in a child supervision tent. One of the sign-in sheets, digitized only recently, listed the Brand boys as participants in a scavenger hunt. Their names had been crossed out with a thin red pen, with a note beside them. Departed early, parental pickup. Marla had never picked them up. No one had. The officer interviewing the Jubilee staff confirmed that no identification had been checked when children left. It had been a different time. Procedures were lax. Volunteers were trusted, especially those like Cartwright, who had charisma and a well-worn smile. Marla found herself staring again at the photo from the attic. The man's hand on Micah's shoulder now felt more like a grip. She remembered something then, something she'd forgotten in the fog of grief. A week before the boys disappeared, Micah had come home with a bracelet he said was a prize from a nice man at the park. She hadn't thought much of it then, just a cheap rubber band with a smiley face. But what if it had been Cartwright? What if the man had been watching longer than they knew? The deeper the probe went, the more inconsistencies emerged. A tip from a former Child Hope volunteer mentioned that Cartwright often kept detailed logs, scrapbooks of his programs, photos, lists. Kinnard obtained a warrant to search the Idaho cabin, but when deputies arrived, the place was empty, abandoned, dust settling over unopened cans and mildewed blankets. They found a trunk in the attic. Inside were notebooks, dozens of them. Some pages were blank, others contained vague records, initials, dates, town names. One entry read, M.N., Elmridge, final contact July 3rd, 94. Marla's knees nearly gave out. Caleb, Micah, Noah, the boys' initials, the date, 11 days before they vanished. In the back of the notebook was a photograph taped to a page. It was blurry, but it showed 3 children from behind, seated on a dock, their feet just touching the surface of a lake. They wore matching windbreakers, red like the ones her boys had worn. Kinnard brought the evidence back for full analysis, but the image was aged and degraded. It offered no clear proof. Still, Marla stared at it for hours, every angle, every contour. She felt, for the first time in decades, something sharper than grief. She felt fury. But what struck her most wasn't the photograph, it was the card she found tucked between the notebook pages. A postcard. A scene of 3 pine trees, for a lake on the back in clean, tight cursive. We are not lost, we are just away. It wasn't dated, it wasn't signed, but it had the same rhythm, the same eerie precision as the others she'd received for years. She placed it with the rest in the wooden box in her closet, then called Grace upstairs. There was more to find, and they would find it. The photograph from the attic and the postcard tucked into the notebook had reawakened something dormant in Marla, something sharper than desperation, steadier than hope. She no longer sat passively in the fog of what-ifs and memory scraps. Now she moved with a purpose that unsettled even her. Detective Kinnard, who had taken on the case again unofficially, began pulling Cartwright's full employment history. There were gaps, too many, but one period stood out, a stretch from late 1993 to mid-1995, where Cartwright had reportedly worked as a developmental mentor at a private-run residential youth facility called Timber Creek Shelter just north of Spokane, Washington. The shelter had been shut down in 1996 following a state investigation that concluded the facility failed to meet basic standards for hygiene, nutrition, and supervision. Reports described overcrowded bunk rooms, untrained staff, and children left unattended for hours. No criminal charges were filed, but the place was quietly erased from public directories. No one wanted to remember what had happened behind those pine-garden fences. Marla found a grainy photo of Timber Creek in a forgotten corner of an online forum dedicated to orphanage survivors. It showed the dilapidated main house, gray wooden panels peeling from decades of weather, a sagging porch, and cracked windows barely visible through a tangle of weeds. The sight of it sent a chill through her. She emailed Kinnard immediately. If they were ever hidden, she wrote, this is the kind of place someone like him would choose. He agreed. Within a week, he secured access to old employment logs from the Washington Department of Child Services. There, buried in a typewritten spreadsheet scanned into microfilm, was Cartwright's name, Stephen L. Cartwright, caregiver, assigned to Boys Quarters B3 from March 1994 to July 1995. No specific duties listed, just an address, a start date, and a note in the margin that read, "Good report with younger residents." Kinnard drove out to the site. The property had long since been sold and turned into a hunting lodge, but the original outbuildings remained, covered in moss and silence. He took photos, noting the worn door frames, the rusted lock hinges. He interviewed the caretaker, an elderly man named Roden, who said the previous owner left behind boxes of papers stored in a shed out back. Most were moldy, unreadable, but in one folder was a list of children assigned to the shelter in 1994. The initials matched no known databases. But then came an anomaly. An entry dated May 21, 1994, recorded 3 male minors estimated age 7 assigned jointly to Dorm B-3. Listed as temporary emergency intake, no names, just a delivery note, drop off by external volunteer transport. Unverified garden. Kinnard's skin went cold. That date was 18 days after the Brant boys had disappeared. He returned with the document to Marla, who sat in stunned silence. "That's them," she said, voice barely audible. "No doubt." But it wasn't enough. They needed more. Grace took to internet forums, posting cautiously in spaces for adults who had aged out of the foster system. She kept the details vague, looking for anyone who remembers Timber Creek Shelter, spring of 1994. Especially memories of 3 boys who looked alike. She didn't expect a response, but within 3 days she received a private message. The sender used a dummy account. Their message was brief. "I remember them. They didn't talk much. People called them the Echoes," Grace replied instantly. The person agreed to a call, but insisted on remaining anonymous using voice modulation software. When the call connected, the voice was distorted but steady. Took scared the oldest, maybe by minutes, always stood in front of the others like a shield. They never gave their names. We all had numbers there. One of them had a small scar under his chin. I think it came from before. Not from the shelter. Marilyn confirmed Caleb had a scar from falling on a toy truck at age 4, the voice continued. They arrived in a white van. No adults came in with them, just dropped at the gate. Cartwright was the one who signed the sheet. I saw it. Kinnard asked for any more details. The voice hesitated, then said, "They were only there for maybe 6 months. Then one night, gone. No goodbyes, no explanation, just gone." The line went quiet. Marla stared at the wall for a long time after the call ended. The photo of the lake with the 3 boys on the dock, was it taken during that window? Were they taken from Timber Creek and moved again? Why? She reviewed the dates. May to November 1994, 6 months. That how long the file listed them before vanishing. If they had escaped, someone would have reported it, but no incident was logged. No missing child report filed from Timber Creek that year, which meant either they were transferred officially and someone buried the record, or they were taken again, unofficially. Grace dug deeper. She found a newspaper article from 1996, just before Timber Creek shut down. It mentioned a former staffer who had anonymously accused another employee of secret night runs where children were ever brought. The paper didn't name names, but the timeline fit. Cartwright had still been employed then. Kinnard sent an inquiry to the state's Child Welfare Historical Archives. Within days, he received a redacted complaint from 1995 filed by a junior staffer accusing a Stephen C. of isolating 3 boys and keeping them off scheduled activities. The report was ignored, labeled insufficient basis. Marla sat at the kitchen table, her fingers tracing the edge of the latest postcard. 3 birds perched on a single branch. The postmark was faded but legible. Idaho Falls. The more they uncovered, the more it felt like peeling wallpaper in an abandoned house. Every layer revealed more decay, more negligence. Someone had known, multiple people, over multiple years, and yet no one had acted. She looked out the window at the darkening sky. Somewhere her boys had slept in a strange bed, eaten strange food, answered to numbers. And someone, somewhere, had made sure she wouldn't know until now. 2 weeks after the anonymous testimony about Timber Creek, the investigation took another unexpected turn. Kinnard received a message from a contact in Idaho's Department of Vital Records. A social worker had filed an unusual note during a routine background check for a man named Carl Sutter, age 35, who had applied for a job working with at-risk youth in Idaho Falls. The man had passed all checks, except one anomaly. The system flagged his birth certificate as a late registration with irregularities. When pressed, Carl said he had no memory of his early childhood, only that he'd grown up in several institutions in the Northwest. He'd been adopted at age 9, under sealed terms, and his adoptive parents were now deceased. But what caught the attention of the social worker was his resemblance to the old missing persons file she happened to see in a training course just days earlier, a poster from 1994 for the Brant triplets. The resemblance, she said, was disturbing in its precision. Kinnard requested photographs. When he opened the email, his breath caught. The man in the photos had darker hair now, a faint scar under his chin, and deeper lines around the eyes, but the structure, the jawline, the slant of the eyebrows were unmistakable. It was Caleb, or someone who could only be hidden. Kinnard didn't want to raise Marla's hopes, not yet, not without proof. He drove out to her home that same afternoon. The sun cast long shadows across her living room as he sat opposite her, explaining the lead, the name, the location. She didn't speak. She simply nodded, slowly, and asked, "What do you need from me?" He answered, "DNA, just a swab. It'll take a few days." The sample was taken immediately. Within 5 days, the results were back. A 99.98% match. Carl Sutter was Caleb Brant, alive, living under a different name, in a different life, less than 8 hours away. Marla sat frozen as Kinnard relayed the confirmation. He said no doubt, but then he added something she hadn't prepared for. He doesn't want to meet. Marla blinked. "What?" Kinnard read from the statement Carl had given the local caseworker. "I don't want contact. I know who she is. I know what happened. She left us. She didn't come." Marla's voice cracked. "That's not true." Kinnard leaned forward, gently. "We believe he was told something different. Maybe for years. We don't know what he remembers, or what he was made to believe." Grace was the one who broke down crying. Marla didn't. She simply sat there, shoulders still, eyes distant. "He thinks I abandoned them?" she asked softly. Kinnard nodded. "It's likely. Children who grow up in isolation like that, their memories reshape. Stories are planted, especially by people trying to hide something. That night, Marla stared at the last postcard she'd received, 3 pine cones on snow, Idaho Falls. She wondered if Caleb had sent it, if he had looked at the photo before mailing it, if his fingers had touched the same paper now resting in her lap. She spent the entire evening writing a letter, simple, honest, pleading. Not to justify, not to beg, just to tell him what she had done, what she still remembered. She enclosed a photograph, one of the 3 boys sitting in their Halloween costumes in 1992. She sealed the envelope and gave it to Kinnard to forward. He did. She waited. No response came. Over the next week, Kinnard and Grace tried to piece together Carl's life from age 9 onward. Adoption records were sealed under an alias. But there were notes. He'd been moved 3 times, never adopted until a retired couple in Boise took him in. He finished high school, attended a small college, became a counselor. No records of his brothers either. Marla began painting again. Not landscapes this time. She painted faces. 3 of them, always from memory, sometimes in shadow, sometimes laughing. She painted them side by side, then apart. In one canvas she painted only their backs, walking away from her into fog. Kinnard returned 3 days later. Carl had sent a message, not directly to her, but through the department. "Tell her I'm alive, but I don't need a mother now. I needed one then." Marla read the words slowly, twice, then folded the note and placed it inside the wooden box with the postcards. She whispered, "You still have one, whether you want her or not." And then came another surprise. An unsigned letter, no return address, just a single line. "You found one. Now find the other 2. Attached was a grainy photo, 2 young men seated on a bench in what looked like a transit station. Both wore dark hoodies. One had his head down, the other looked directly into the camera. The resemblance to Micah was haunting. Marla's hands trembled as she passed the photo to Kinnard. Grace stood in silence, her breath caught. Somewhere the story wasn't over. Not yet. The photograph of the 2 young men had rekindled urgency in the investigation, but it was a voicemail left on Kinnard's personal line that brought the case into sharp focus. It was from Carl, Caleb, his voice calm but edged with something raw, as if the act of speaking the words drained him. "I remember now," he said. "It came back in pieces, but it's clearer now. You were right. I wasn't supposed to forget. I was made to—" Marla listened to the recording in silence, clutching her hands together until the knuckles whitened. Caleb's voice had grown deeper, but the cadence, the rhythm, was unmistakable. He continued. "It started a week before. He came to the fence every afternoon, said Mom didn't want us anymore, said we were too much, said she was tired of crying. He gave us candy, told us stories about a place where we'd never have to cry again. We didn't believe him at first, but then he started knowing things. What we ate for breakfast, what Micah dreamed about. Noah was the first to trust him." Marla inhaled sharply. He was Dale? Kinnard had always suspected Dale's involvement, but now they had a first-hand account. Caleb's voice faltered on the message, then resumed, almost mechanically. "The night we left, he said we were going to see Mom, said she was waiting for us. He picked us up after dark, told us to be quiet, said it was a surprise. We climbed into his truck. There was a blanket in the back. He gave us juice boxes." I remember Micah fell asleep leaning against the door. "We didn't go to Mom. We drove a long time. He didn't talk, just sat music, soft. Then we stopped in a parking lot. Another man was there. He had glasses. He smiled a lot. Too much. That was Cartwright. They talked like they were trading furniture. Cartwright gave Dale an envelope. Dale didn't even say goodbye. He just walked off." The recording ended. Marla stared at the wall, a dull ache spreading across her chest. The betrayal was complete. Dale, the man who'd smiled at her across the fence, who'd repaired her hose, who'd once helped hang Christmas lights, had sold her children like they were things. She stood up slowly, walked to the kitchen, poured a glass of water with shaking hands, and asked Kinnard, "Do you know where he is?" Kinnard shook his head. "He dropped off the map. After Cartwright's trail went cold, Dale stopped using traceable IDs. But we're looking." Grace had already begun searching online. She found an old photo of Dale from a community softball game in 1992. She uploaded it to a reverse image search engine and scanned dozens of faces from across social media. One hit came close. A man in his late 60s, balding, working as a groundskeeper at a church compound in Utah under the name Harold Dean. The resemblance was alarming. Kinnard dispatched a local investigator to confirm. The man was gone, left 2 weeks prior, no forwarding address. Meanwhile, Marla received another postcard. This one arrived without a postmark. It had been hand-delivered, slipped under her door during the night. A photograph of a single swing swaying over a patch of sand. On the back, "We didn't know, but now we do." She pressed it to her chest, as if holding it tightly might bring Caleb closer. Later that week, Caleb agreed to a video call. It was brief, strained, but necessary. Marla sat in front of the screen, heart pounding, as her son appeared, older, cautious, guarded. He didn't smile. "I'm not ready," he said. "But I owe you the truth." He recounted what Dale had told them, the manipulation, the quiet venom planted over days until doubt festered. "He made it sound like you were glad to be rid of us, said you'd moved on, said we were just in the way. I think Micah believed him the most. Noah didn't. He cried when we left. I held his hand the whole ride." Marla wept silently. Caleb paused. "I wanted to believe you'd come for us. I think part of me still did, but when no one came, I had to believe something else, just to stay sane." He didn't ask about her life. He didn't want stories. He only said, "They're out there, Micah and Noah. I know it. I feel it." Then the screen went dark. Kinnard launched a new task force, leveraging the admission to reclassify the case as a child trafficking operation. Dale Hemsworth became a person of high interest in a federal investigation. Old banking records, backtracked from the envelope exchange Caleb recalled, hinted at a pattern. Small deposits under alias names, all linked to rural towns. Cartwright had acted as a middleman. Dale had been the supplier. Marla stood by the window, watching the wind bend the trees. She whispered their names again. Caleb, Micah, Noah. Her voice cracked, not with pain, but with clarity. The truth had always been there, buried beneath polite neighbors and overlooked warnings, and now it was clawing to the surface. The days following Caleb's confession passed like heavy fog, thick and slow. Marla found herself wandering the house aimlessly, touching old frames, glancing at rooms that hadn't been used in years. She didn't need Kinnard to tell her the next part would be worse, that the truth, once started, didn't come cleanly, but arrived in splinters and bruises. The investigation team followed new leads from Caleb's recollections, tracing the vague outlines of what might have happened to Micah and Noah after they were separated at Timber Creek. Caleb didn't know exactly when it had happened, only that one night they were told they'd be moved someplace better. Micah went first, then Noah a few days later. Caleb remained behind, likely because he was deemed the oldest or most difficult. The staff told him nothing, but something in him broke that week. Kinnard's team focused on unregistered minors and false identity records from the mid-90s forward. In late October, a file emerged from Idaho's Department of Transportation involving a fatal car accident that occurred outside Coeur d'Alene in 2002. The driver had no license, no social security number, and was buried under the name Mark Densley, estimated age 20. What struck the team was the autopsy report, a broken collarbone that had once healed improperly, matching an old note in Caleb's medical records about Micah's childhood injury. Dental comparisons confirmed the impossible. Micah had died 2 decades ago, a stranger in a borrowed name, alone and unidentified. Kinnard called Marla himself. She didn't. She sat perfectly still, hands folded in her lap, as he explained how Micah's last moments were recorded. Loss of control on a sharp curve, no foul play, no passengers. He was driving too fast, the report said, possibly fleeing something. She hung up the phone and walked outside, standing under the bare branches of the maple tree they'd planted when the boys were born. She stayed there until dusk. Caleb didn't attend the reburial. He said he couldn't. He sent a note instead. He never stopped protecting us, not even then. Marla read it aloud at the gravesite. Only Grace and Kinnard stood beside her. They buried him under his real name, Micah Brandt, 19872002. The headstone was simple. She paid for it in full and left a small car toy atop the stone, his favorite from when he was 5. Just a week later, another break arrived. A volunteer genealogist with the task force had traced a string of old forum posts across defunct websites, places where users spoke in code and anonymity about forgotten lives. One handle stood out, Night 3. The posts dated back to 2015. They spoke of lost brothers, of a mother who maybe never looked, and of dreams about a red barn and a field of sunflowers. Grace read the entries aloud to Marla, who recognized the phrase "field of sunflowers" as something Noah had once drawn repeatedly in preschool. The account was linked to a now inactive email address, but with some digging, they found a matching registration on a social media site under the name Kevin T. Brooks, listing a hometown in Billings, Montana. Kinnard and Grace traveled there first. Kevin had a short arrest record, petty theft, trespassing, one brief incarceration. He worked now as a night janitor in a warehouse, lived in a rented trailer on the outskirts of town. When Kinnard approached him, Kevin froze. He didn't run. He didn't deny. He simply asked, "Is she alive?" When Grace answered yes, Kevin sat down on the curb and began to shake. Over the next hour, Kevin explained everything he remembered. The night he was taken from Timber Creek, the years in group homes, his name changed twice. The silence, the fear, the belief that no one was coming, he said, that if we stayed good, she'd find us. But when no one came, Kevin began to believe they'd been abandoned. He acted out, ran away from 2 homes, got caught stealing food. By 16, he was on the street. "I didn't even remember my real name until I saw a photo online," he said. It was one of those missing kid archives. Someone uploaded it again last year. I recognized my own face. He found Marla's address but never wrote. "What was I supposed to say?" he asked. "Hey, it's me, the son you forgot, the one you lost?" Grace squeezed his shoulder. "She never stopped looking," she said. That evening, Kevin stood in front of Marla's house. He didn't knock at first, just stared at the door like it might vanish. When it finally opened and Marla stood there, thinner now, older, her eyes already filled with tears, he whispered, "I thought you'd slammed." She shook her head and stepped forward. She didn't speak. She only wrapped her arms around him and held on like she might never let go. The silence between their reunion and what came next stretched across weeks, like a slow thaw. Kevin, though still awkward in Marla's presence, began showing up once a week, sometimes bringing small groceries, sometimes bringing nothing but himself. They didn't talk about the years between, not yet. They talked about soup recipes, weather, dogs barking in the distance. The missing pieces hovered around them like ghosts neither of them were ready to name. Then, one cold Thursday evening, as wind scratched at the windows and frost kissed the corners of the porch, a small envelope appeared in Marla's mailbox. It bore no return address, only her name written in steady, deliberate handwriting. Inside was a single photograph, aged but sharp. It was the picture from the Elmridge Fair in 1994, the one Grace had found in the attic months ago. But this copy was clearer, cleaner, not scanned or folded. On the back was a note, "I never forgot you, but we believed you forgot us first." Marla read the words over and over, the ink bleeding slightly at the edges from her trembling fingers. She stared at the photograph for hours that night, studying the familiar faces of her boys, small, trusting, unaware of what was coming. Caleb reached out the following week. His email was short. "Ready to talk? Can we meet?" The meeting was arranged quietly. No press, no police. Just a room in the community center after hours. Grace sat in the corner, silent. Kevin arrived first, eyes darting, heart racing. Caleb came 10 minutes later. He looked different from the man on the screen, older in ways that had nothing to do with time. But his posture straightened when he saw Kevin, and something unspoken passed between them. A glance, a flicker of old memory. They nodded, not quite a hug, but something close. Marla entered last. She stood for a moment in the doorway, taking in the two grown men seated before her. Her sons. She stepped forward slowly, her voice barely a whisper. "You don't owe me anything," she said, "but if you'll let me—" Caleb held up a hand. "Just want the truth." She nodded. She sat down. She told them everything. She told them about the afternoon they vanished, about the shoes left on the porch, the hours spent screaming their names into the wind. She told them about the years that followed, the postcards, the guilt, the silence from law enforcement. She described Dale's betrayal, how trust had been used as currency. Her voice broke only once, when she mentioned the Little League trophy they'd never picked up. When she finished, she looked at each of them and said, "I'm sorry. Not for what I did, but for what I didn't know to stop. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you from what no one warned me about." The room was quiet. Kevin wiped his eyes. Caleb didn't move, but his jaw tightened. "We waited," he said. "For years, we waited. We thought maybe if we were good enough, you'd come. But after a while, we stopped believing. We told ourselves stories to survive. That you were tired, that you'd moved on. It was easier than hoping." Marla nodded slowly. "I would have come for you in a second, if I'd had the faintest clue." "We know that now." They didn't forgive her that night. Forgiveness is rarely born in one conversation, but they began something better, understanding. They shared small memories, ice cream flavors, bedtime songs, the way Noah used to sneak crackers into bed. They laughed once, quietly, when Kevin admitted he'd once convinced Micah that frogs could read minds. Marla smiled, tears sliding down her cheeks. "I remember that summer," she said. "You kept asking for frogs at the pet store." They stayed until the janitor knocked on the door, asking to lock up. Caleb hugged her before leaving. It was stiff, but real. Kevin lingered. "I might come by tomorrow," he said. "We could try that soup recipe." She nodded. "I'd like that." As they left, Marla looked back at the room, empty now, chairs slightly out of place. It didn't matter. Something broken had begun to mend. Not erased, never whole, but healing. Outside, the night was clear and cold, and the stars above were exactly as she remembered from the night her world had shattered, except now, one by one, they were coming back into view. If this story moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more real-life inspired mysteries. What part of the story hit you the hardest? Do you think Caleb ever truly forgave his mother? And where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. Your thoughts matter.